I went out to Brown's Chapel Church on this day, and I'll never forget. There was this teacher by the name of Mrs. Margaret Moore, and I indicated to her that I wanted to participate in that march. She said, "You don't need to march on this march, child." And I said, "Ms. Moore, I want to march." And I started crying, and she took my hand. We prayed before leaving Brown's Chapel Church, and we were in the middle of the marchers making our way downtown Selma. We can see people on the side who were whites, and people were throwing things at us, saying nasty words. You can hear that N word over and over again. And me being a little girl, 8 years old, the faster my heart had begun to beat. And then when we got to the bridge, I could see hundreds of policemen with billy clubs, tear gas masks, policemen on horses, and dogs. And this became even more frightening to me as a child. I didn't want to turn back, but I had become afraid. We were asked to turn around, but all of us marchers refused. Racism unleashed its brutality upon us. Tear gas burst in the air, dogs and horses trampling over people. People were being beaten down, and many of us just started running with tear gas burning our eyes. And I had separated myself from Mrs. Margaret Moore, trying to make my way back home. Both my parents were standing in the door, and I ran straight up the stairs to my bedroom crying. There was this song that we used to always sing during many mass meetings. Oh freedom, over me, and before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. As that little girl, I can vividly remember those things that happened when much blood, sweat, and tears were shed in an effort for people to gain their right to vote. Good morning.
Good morning.
I am grateful to always have the opportunity to share my story, and for my voice and my story to be represented not only by the unsung heroes and sheroes who gave of their lives and who sacrificed and contributed in making this world a better place, but particularly when I'm able to share my story and my voice is heard and being represented for those youth who are being represented today. I see so many people in this audience who have contributed in my life. And I want to just thank you. I thank you, Ms. Judge Dolores Board. I thank you, Nancy Worthy. I thank you, Jean and Robert Grotz. If I hadn't called your name, forgive my heart, but I want to especially thank you for, and of course, Vanzetta McPherson and her mother, Sadie Penn, Mrs. Sadie Penn. When I was that little girl, if it had not been for people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Jonathan Daniels, Viola Luso, Hosea Williams, Reverend James Reeves, James Orange, Margaret Moore. If it had not been for those people who impact my life at such an early age in a most profound way, then I would not have taken the course or the path in which I have. Neither would I have made that conscious decision as that little girl, that I'm often asked questions, well, how could you be so young, being involved or becoming involved in that movement? And with what I saw and experienced as that little girl, it would have struck a chord with any child at any given age. As I looked at the video, and as I was among those in the press conference this morning, I want to thank you, Steve Murray, the director of the Alabama Archives and History, and to Sheyann and all others with the ArchiTreats program here for inviting me. But I can't help but to share emotions when I look at that history of that past, and then as I see and witness as you do with what we're being challenged with today, which is much of the same. You know, true success starts in an attitude and it ends in an action. It comes from belief in oneself and belief in one higher than oneself. It comes quickest to the one who combines confidence and determination with energy and enthusiasm. I say these words because they hold truth with me. Because it was when I was that little 8-year-old girl growing up in Selma, Alabama, from George Washington Carver projects, from a poor family of 8. It was rough. Growing up in the midst of experiencing and witnessing racial discrimination, violence, segregation, injustices, inequality, violence, tears, and even death of people that I had the opportunity to meet and have an intimate relationship with them. Those who lived in my home and other homes next to me and in that community, like Viola Luso, Jonathan Daniels, and many others. This was devastating to me as that child, to meet such great people who had left their homes and who had come to Selma, Alabama to join in that struggle. They left their families. Many came with just sleeping bags, no money, no food. But they came there with a clear conscience and a clear cause that they truly understood. It didn't take me long as that little girl to clearly understand what was going on and what was about to change in Selma, Alabama. And the reason why it didn't take me long, because some will ask, well, how could you really understand all of the things that were happening during those turbulent times, being so young? Well, first, having the opportunity, and I'm so grateful that I had that opportunity to meet Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at such an early age, who had a profound impact on my life. I'll never forget the first day in which I met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. My best friend Rachel and I were playing in the now historic Browns Chapel AME Church, as we often would do, because our homes in George Washington Carver Projects was right on the side of the church. And we would often go and play in front of Browns Chapel Church, and on this particular day, something unusual was happening. And we saw these beautiful cars that had driven up. And obviously, as little girls, it gravitated our attention. And before we knew it, we had walked to the first 3 cars that had driven up. And as his entourage was getting out of their cars, I'll never forget that there were these 4 to 5 men standing there who were well groomed. And there was one particular man who had a nice black suit coat jacket. And then there was another man that others were surrounding him. He had on a nice white starchy shirt with a black tie and black slacks. And this man who had the black jacket, Steve, he said to us as little girls, he said, "Do you little girls know who this man is?" And of course, we didn't know who any of them were. He said to us that this is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And instantly, Dr. King started talking to us. He started asking us the normal questions that adults will ask little girls and little boys. He asked us our names. He asked us where did we live, and I remember pointing my little finger in the direction of where I lived. And then, of course, he asked what grade we were in and where did we go to school. And my school was just 2 streets over. I had to pass Browns Chapel Church in order to go to school. And then he asked the question, "How are you girls doing in school?" And of course, my being not only an inquisitive little girl when I was in school, I was always that little girl who wanted to be up front, being active. And we followed Dr. King and his entourage as they were about to have a strategy meeting on this day at Browns Chapel Church. And they were going in the back door. And as they got to that back door, the same man who had that jacket and asked us, did we know who this man is, he said to us as we were about to follow Dr. King and his entourage into the door, he said, "You little girls can go on and play now because we're about to have a meeting." And Dr. King suddenly said to him, and he took us by our hands, he said, "No, let them come on in." And as he took us by our hands and took us on into that church in the room in which they were about to get ready to have that meeting, Dr. King went and got 2 chairs. And he took those chairs in the back of that room, and he asked us to have a seat. And then he went and got himself a chair, and he sat his chair in front of us before this meeting would start. And then as he sat there, he asked us some questions. He said to us, "What do you little girls want?" And my best friend Rachel and I looked at each other, not knowing how to respond to that question. He said that, "When I ask you little girls, what do you want? I want you to say what?" He said, "Say it louder." You can do better than that. Say it louder. The next question that he asked us was, "Now when do you little girls want it?" And we looked at each other, not knowing how to respond to that question. He said, "Now when I ask you little girls, when do you want it? I want you to say," now. He said, "Say it louder, little girls." Now. This was my first acquaintance with the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A day and a time in which I would never, ever forget. And before Dr. King would start that meeting, he said to us, "I want to see you little girls before I leave." And of course, Rachel and I were so excited, we couldn't wait to get home to tell our parents that we had met this man by the name of Dr. King. And when I said that to my dad, I was so excited, it was almost as if I had met Santa Claus. He said to me, "You just better stay from around that mess." And I didn't quite understand that. But even in spite of him telling me that, I was determined to see Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. before he would leave Brown's Chapel Church on that day. And I did. And as they had finished that meeting, it was hours and hours we were in and out of that church just waiting on him. Then we walked Dr. King to his car as he and his entourage were about to leave. And Dr. King said to us, he said that there's going to be a movement here in Selma. And I'm coming back for a mass meeting. And I want to see you little girls there. And little did we know about a movement, and little did we know about a mass meeting. And days later, there were people who were passing out leaflets in the community talking about this mass meeting. And of course, you must know that it wasn't even accepted in many homes. They didn't even want to receive it, and many were shutting their doors and wouldn't even receive the leaflet. And I know this because Rachel and I, we helped to pass the leaflets out. And we were looking forward to this mass meeting. And of course, in spite of my parents warning me over and over again that I couldn't be at that mass meeting, I had already made up in my mind that I was going to be there. So I slipped out of my back door and I went into Brown's Chapel Church along with Rachel. And we went straight to the front pew of Brown's Chapel Church, and we sat there with the other courageous people who were there. And they were singing freedom songs, and we started clapping our hands and patting our feet, and we were singing freedom songs and joining with them. And it didn't take us long to learn those songs. And one of the songs in which they were singing on that first mass meeting was, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. And then we were singing, we shall not be moved. And all of a sudden, as all of the people who were there at that mass meeting were singing this particular song, it transitioned as Dr. King and his entourage was making their way to the pulpit in Brown's Chapel Church. That song transitioned to, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And everybody had begun to just stand on their feet and clap their hands louder. They were very encouraged, and it was a great sense of enthusiasm just to see him and his entourage make their way to that pulpit. And Dr. King stood there, and he just looked over the crowd. And as he looked over the crowd, before he would even get a chance to sit down, Rachel and I were sitting on his lap. And of course, that mass meeting took place, and we were there sitting, listening to Dr. King speak. And Dr. King had already become special to me as that little girl. But when I heard his voice, and when I heard him speak about how many African Americans who didn't have the right to vote, when I heard him talk about all of the changes in terms of people not being equal, I understood some of those things clearly. I understood when I used to see the for only colored signs and the for only white signs. And when I listened to his speech that night, some things became even clearer to me that a child could comprehend. And I also knew the difference not only between black and white, but I only took a direct interest in his speech in terms of what he was saying that was right and was wrong, and which we as African Americans were seeing every day. Even as that child, after having met Dr. King many times, that he would come to Selma, Alabama for mass meetings with his entourage, with the former ambassador Andy Young, the now Congressman John Lewis, Reverend James Orange. I can go on. These people I would see all the time. But Dr. King, as that child, he truly was plucking me from poverty and the ignorance of Selma, which I didn't know at the time, that was elevating my consciousness and taking me to a new level. Yes, I was different. I was that child who was different from my siblings and my other peers, because I had made a decision, a conscious decision. You really couldn't be in the midst of those mass meetings with those courageous foot soldiers who had come from other places, who were a part of SNCC, SCLC. You couldn't be in the midst of those people who had that deep, embedded spirit and a fervent faith, and knowing that they had come to do whatever it took to change the lives of African American and the nation, but especially to fight and to struggle for African Americans to gain their right to vote. I was there. Dr. King gave me hope. And he gave me a sense of achievement, which motivated me to do something and make me feel like I had to do something to make a difference in that process. And even as that child, you had to make a decision for all of the people who were there, who was courageous enough to join in that movement or not to join in it. And it wasn't ordinary for adults to participate, nevertheless, a child. But Dr. King motivated me, and he continued to inspire me to not only do my best, but to be my best and not be ashamed. I could go on and tell you many stories about this special and unique and historical experience as a child. But Dr. King instilled in me at an early age, and that is why, as that little girl, as I continued to matriculate through that movement and go out in the fields and continue to be a youth activist, getting people registered to vote, marching to the courthouse, defying continuously over and over again my parents, even until the point where I just started bringing freedom fighters home to keep from being whipped. I would bring them home with me. And it was very, very difficult because I still was that child who had feelings, and I would cry. And when I brought those freedom fighters home, and it was staying at the churches with sleeping bags, but I started taking them home as Rachel did. And I was asking my parents, would you please let them stay? And it was very difficult for my parents to turn them around, even in spite of them being afraid. Yes, Dr. King instilled in me and others like Jonathan Daniels so much that has made me the person that I am today from childhood to present. And one of the most physical attributes that I could have obtained as that little girl growing up in that movement was to gain that good character based upon my experience. I was among the first 6 African Americans who integrated Parish High School, and I was ready for the challenge because I knew that I could compete because Dr. King and others had taught me. I believed in myself regardless of the color of my skin, and it wasn't easy. But I became one of the first African Americans to become on the cheerleading squad, on the volleyball team, the basketball team. I was determined to be my best and to do my best, even in spite of being pushed down the stairs, called names, My parents having to go over to my schools often to talk to the principal, even when much wasn't done about it. But that character still remained in me. But what was the most traumatic experience of my life was my participation on the Bloody Sunday March. I'll never forget the many threats that had been made about the possibilities of what would happen to anyone who would participate in that march. Yes, I was there. I remember that day vividly. I marched with the late Mrs. Margaret Moore, and I remember marching, making my way as that little girl to the Edmund Pettus Bridge with the other courageous freedom fighters. And the closer we got to the bridge, it seems like my heart would beat faster and faster as I would see whites on the sides trying to distract us, but we kept our heads moving forward. And then when I looked over and saw hundreds of policemen with billy clubs, tear gas masks, horses and dogs, I had even become more frightened. When we were asked to turn around, then racism unleashed its brutality upon us. And of course, I started running, as many others, trying to make my way back to George Washington Carver Projects. And I'll never forget, as I was running, I could hear the sirens. I could still see the horses just pushing their way into the crowd of the marchers, trampling over them as if they weren't even human beings. And my eyes had been tear gassed like so many others. And I could remember the late Hosea Williams picking me up, and my little legs were still galloping in his arms. And I turned to him and I said, "Put me down, because you're not running fast enough." You know, the picture of Bloody Sunday has never left my heart, neither my mind. I would never forget, after getting home, my parents standing in the door, and my dad had his shotgun, and it was as if they were just glad to see their little child get home. And I'll never forget running up the stairs to my bedroom. And as I was crying and they were trying to comfort me, I went to my drawer and got paper and started writing my funeral arrangement in my own childish words. And that's when I started thinking about that song, Shayla, with the lyrics of "Old freedom, old freedom, over me, over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." That's when I truly understood what that song really meant. But as I close, even as we have just commemorated the 50th anniversary of that Bloody Sunday March, I often question just how far we have come. 50 years later, much blood, sweat, and tears were shed on that bridge in an effort for African Americans to gain the right to vote. And yet, 50 years today, people still are not exercising that right to vote. While we have elected our first African American president and even our first African American mayors in the city of Selma, we still have a long way to go. The struggle is not over. Today, not only in southern states, but all over the United States, racism still rears its head in an attempt to disarm people of their identity and respect as human beings. I do submit to you this morning or this afternoon that we have progress socially, politically, and economically, but we still have much work to do. I leave you with this quote that has stuck with me from childhood to present, with a speech that I vividly remember in one of Dr. King's speeches. He quoted that everyone can be great because everyone can serve. You only need a heart full of grace with a soul that's generated by love. As I work with young people as a youth advocate, and not just educating them, but trying to instill in them that they do matter. They matter now more than ever. This is their time. This is their movement now. I always tell them that greatness is never obtained by being served. Greatness is always obtained by serving others. And I overemphasize to them that you are great. You are our voices of change. You are our vessels of hope. And you are our instruments of peace. So as we move forward, 50 years forward, let us embrace our youth and leadership development, education, as we continue to come together in unity, as Dr. Martin Luther King and others spoke about that beloved community, and not only make a difference in our lives, but also in the lives of others. Thank you so very much. Hello. Okay, I'm ready to take a few questions for any of you who may have. Where can you buy my book? First, I have some cards with me with that information on it, and you can always go to any bookstore and get them ordered through Amazon. Any other questions?
What happened to your friend Rachel?
Rachel is still in Selma, Alabama. She's enjoying her 5 grandkids now. I must say to you that Rachel and I grew up as best friends, and we still are great friends. But my focus and my path went in another direction. My focus, which was fuel
from my participation as that little girl was to work with young people. And that is what I have done for 36 years. And now Rachel is now retired. She had a tragic, her husband had a tragic accident a few years ago. He worked for the railroad, and she's still trying to deal with that situation, but we're still in touch with each other.
You mentioned that your parents initially discouraged you from, or told you to stay away from that mess, as they put it. Did their attitude toward this development reflect the majority of black citizens in Selma? And the second part of my question, were you ever punished for hanging out with those people?
Well, the first part of your question is their attitude certainly reflected the feelings and the reactions of most people during that time, because you got to remember, when that movement first started in Selma, most people had come from other places. There were very few teachers who became involved in that movement who was from Selma. Reverend F.D. Reese, Mrs. Margaret Moore, and of course, Miss Amelia Boynton Robertson, because most people were afraid. And later, that attitude changed, especially after the Bloody Sunday March. And that's even when my parents became more involved. And a little before that, even though they started accepting those freedom fighters in my home, it helped. The influence with them living in the home helped them to get not only a better understanding, but it helped them to subtract a little of the fear that they had, which took a lot of pressure off of me in a real sense, because to be honest, my parents, they would get up in the morning, get ready for work, go to work. They couldn't control where I would go and how I would slip out. And many times I wouldn't go to school. I would leave home without getting my hair combed. Viola Luso was the person who tried to be that person to try to keep my hair combed and keep me groomed, because I never gave my mother especially, that opportunity. And that was just that. It was just something inside of me. It was almost like I was fighting for them because they couldn't do it. So many of the pictures that are even here at the archives, you will see pictures of me with my hair not being combed most of the time. But they did change those attitudes like so many others, and they became very proud of me. And one of my wishes was for them to become registered voters for my birthday, and they did.
What happened to the teacher?
What happened to
the teacher?
Mrs. Margaret Moore? She passed. She was one of, and Tanya, I know you remember Mrs. Margaret Moore. Mrs. Margaret Moore reminded me so much, Vanzetta, of your mother, Mrs. Sadie Penn. And when I first got to Montgomery, Alabama, you know, I think when you are surrounded, and that's why I tell young people how important it is for you to surround yourselves with people of wisdom. And that was the type of person that I was. I was so used to being around older people who had the knowledge and the experiences that my mother and my father couldn't give me. But I had a little bit more balance on each side because I came from a poor family. And Mrs. Margaret Moore and Mrs. Boynton and others, they were middle class people. and my godparents were middle class people. So I had the best of so many worlds. And when your exposure level gives you those opportunities to not only be surrounded by those people, but to learn from them, to listen to them, you know, and that's what kept me in the path, even though of righteousness, even though I was disobedient. I was just standing up for what I believed in that was right as that child. And Mrs. Moore reminded me so much of your mother, Mrs. Sadie Penn. And that's when I came to Montgomery. I embraced myself around women of wisdom who I call my special ladies. And I still do that now as a 59-year-old woman, because we have to stay in the learning curve and keep ourselves surrounded by people of wisdom who can keep us on the right path.
Did you, during that time, did you attend any of the meetings, preparation for the freedom fighters during that time, prior to that day that you were in the presence of Martin Luther King?
No, ma'am. There were marchers who consisted of young people who were students from R.B. Hudson High School. My sister and my brother were part of those marches. And after they were on a couple of marches, that's when I started becoming a little inquisitive. But when I met Dr. King, which was a very short time after that, that's when I really became involved, and I started marching to the courthouse, and I was at the Burden Wall, everything. I used to skip school, and to be honest with you, I would go to school late sometime, and I would be the person who reported to my teachers, because they did want to know what was going on, even though they were afraid. Yes, I remember, if you all, any of you seen the movie Selma, Lord Selma, Mrs. Bright was my teacher at that time. And I was punished a couple of times, but at the end of the day, they really appreciated my position and my courage for me standing up for what I believed in, but it was later. And then they all became involved, most of them, and that was the Teachers' March.
We got one here and then.
Van.
When you were, when Dr. King was giving his speech here in Montgomery, where were you with him?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I'll never forget. Let me tell you something. I used to slip away every day. And of course, I was warned not to participate on the successful march, because people didn't really know what would happen. But on that particular march, that's why Dr. King and his entourage, they strategized and organized a lot. They had transportation behind the marchers, because there were older people who were marching. There were some people who were even on crutches, if you would see some of the pictures. So they had transportation that would take people back and forth, because once they would stop at night and have rallies at churches or whatever, some people were being transported back to Selma to sleep. And what I would do is join the marches every day, and I'll end up getting transported back home, in the evenings. And during this time, My parents felt a little bit more relieved because they knew where I was. And they knew that I was surrounded by other adults. But this was the most unique experience for me. The last day, on that last leg of the march, I was under the umbrella and care of Dr. King's, one of his staff members who was his secretary. She literally, when Dr. King, some of you may see that picture with me, with him talking to him. He had the leaf around his neck. I had gone up to him at one point on the march, and he had no idea that I was marching. And that's when he asked me what did I want, why was I there? And I said that I wanted to be free, and I wanted all people to be free and be equal and have justice. I understood that. And on the last march leading to St. Jude, that's when he had his secretary to call my parents and tell them that I was in good care and they could pick me up at St. Jude that night at the rally. And that was my first time. I remember them going to, you all remember the Albert Peak Hotel. They went to the Albert, they took me to the Albert Peak Hotel after we had gotten to Montgomery. And they were having a meeting preparing for that rally that night. And I remember as they were meeting, they were asking me what did I want to eat because they were ordering food, as they were having their meeting. And Dr. King said to me, do you want a club sandwich? And I didn't even know what a club sandwich was. And of course, they ordered me a club sandwich, and I'll never forget eating my first club sandwich at Albert Peak Hotel with Dr. King. And just sitting there, and many times I would just be sitting around. You know how little kids hang around people that they love and like, and you learn from those things. And I just sat there listening and watching the way in which they strategize. And of course that night my parents met me. They made an announcement after the rally that they could pick me up behind the stage, and I cried all the way back to Selma. But you know what happened the next day? My parents joined me the next day, brought me back to Montgomery, and they marched with me, along with my brother. So those are great memories, vivid memories that I'll never forget. And as a matter of fact, many things that I experienced was not told in the book, neither the movie. I have another project that's coming out, and the title will be Didn't Let Nobody Turn Me Around. Yes, and I'm looking forward to that.
Mrs. Christburg, just thank you for sharing your experiences. I really appreciate this opportunity. And I think I could surmise basically on what you've presented up to this point about the kinds and types of people that you were exposed to. And being exposed especially to black men at such an early age, the image that was presented to you, can you make a comparison between then and now on the kind of image that has been presented or that you have been exposed to with regards to the black male image?
Most certainly. Being that little girl and Dr. King becoming so special to me, along with Jonathan Daniels and others, most of those people, especially Hosea Williams, and Andy Young and others, Jesse Jackson, Stokely Carmichael. Now, I could remember being around them even when they would be having meetings. And one thing that I noticed the difference, there are several things that I noticed the difference between then and now. Number one, oftentimes when I would be sitting there and they would be meeting and I'm listening, I saw how they disagreed to agree, how they came together. Because initially, everybody was not on the same page. But I saw how Dr. King was able to, under his leadership, bring everybody together. Today, I don't see that much. There's a big difference. And that's why it's so important for us to not just talk about young people. We really got to embrace them in a very special way. Not only to know their history, but to gain a better interest and appreciation so that when they actually begin to dialogue about the challenges in which we are being challenged with, in which they are going to be a great part of that process. Because to me, they are the new movement. And that's why it's so critical for us to work with them with leadership development, peaceful protests with dignity, integrity. I saw a lot of that. I also noticed the difference in how people were dressed. You know, people came there for a cause, but they were very cognitive of how they looked. If you look at those pictures, you will see how they were really dressed. And the thing that I liked most was the spirit in which people work. And when you have the right spirit and you're on the same page for the same cause, you always will get the better results. And we need to see more of that. And there were many men, there were women involved. You know, there were many women involved who made the difference. And a lot of times those women were sitting in the background, many of them, doing a lot of the real work, but they were a part of the changes that really existed. But all of those people that worked, those men that worked with Dr. King, and he really set the tone. He was well-groomed. He was a very well-groomed man. And the people who were around him were well-groomed. And so that's why it's important today for us as we continue to embrace and be role models and talk and stay in the teaching mode with our young people. We got to deal with the etiquettes. And we got to deal with the communications etiquettes, the table etiquettes, the social etiquettes, the dressing etiquettes. None of those things can be subtracted along with the educational aspect of it, because they are very critical in everything that they do moving forth to becoming the productive leaders in which we've been waiting for and that we need. That's my focus.
Okay, we are past the hour now, so if anyone has any additional questions, feel free to come up. But I do want to just say thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.